There are conflicts that feel permanent, not the ordinary disagreements that time softens, but the specific, documented, mutually witnessed explosions that leave marks on the public record that neither party can erase. The kind where things were said on camera, in reunion specials, in interviews, in the specific language of people who stopped performing civility and were operating from genuine anger. Darcey Silva has had several of those conflicts. You know the ones. The moments that made you think those two people will never be in the same room again without lawyers present. And then, in the way that only real life produces because no writer's room would have the courage to script this, they ended up not just in the same room. They ended up on the same side, with a shared project, with mutual investment in each other's success, with the specific warmth of people who understand each other the way only former enemies can. If that already has your attention, and it should hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Tell-All Tapes. We cover the stories that the official narrative doesn't want you to connect. And what we are about to walk through today is one of the most structurally fascinating developments in the entire history of this franchise. Stay with me. Every single step of this is worth your time. Let's go back to the beginning of the conflict, because you cannot understand what the alliance means without fully understanding what it replaced. The enmity between Darcy and this person was not a manufactured storyline for ratings, though it certainly served that purpose. It was something messier and more real than that. It was the collision of two people who occupied similar spaces in a specific ecosystem, who were competing for similar audiences, similar brand deals, similar positioning in the public conversation about what 90 Day Fiancé actually produces in terms of human beings once the cameras stop rolling. That kind of competition over finite attention, finite sponsorship dollars, finite cultural real estate creates the most durable resentments because it is never entirely personal. It is structural. Two people fighting over the same territory do not need to personally dislike each other to behave as if they do. The territory creates the conflict even when the people involved are fundamentally decent. But what was said between them went beyond structural competition. There were specific moments. I am not going to detail every one of them, because this channel does not exist to relitigate grievances, but specific moments where the language used was not the language of professional rivalry. It was personal. It was targeted at vulnerabilities that were only visible because both parties had been public enough, long enough, that the vulnerabilities were documented. You knew where to aim when you wanted to cause maximum damage to Darcy, and the other party aimed there. And Darcy returned fire with information and framing that was equally targeted, equally precise, equally designed to leave a mark that would be findable in search results for years. That is the record. That is what exists. That is the foundation under which both of their names are now jointly attached to a funded, in-production project. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because the cognitive gap between those two facts, the documented enmity and the current collaboration, is the most interesting space in this entire story. How do two people cross that gap? Not perform crossing it, not announce crossing it in a press release with language calibrated to manage the audience's reaction. Actually cross it. Actually arrive at a place where the cooperation is real enough to sign contracts, to attach names to a project, to have the specific body language of people who have had a private conversation that genuinely changed something. Here is my reading of how it happened. And I want to be clear that this is analysis, not reporting. I do not have access to the private conversations, and neither does any other commentary channel regardless of what they tell you. What I have is the behavioral evidence and the structural logic. And the structural logic runs like this. At some point in the last 18 months, both of their individual platforms hit a ceiling. Not a ceiling collapse. The kind of plateau that public figures on reality television hit when their primary source of content is their own life, and their own life has cycled through enough dramatic chapters that the audience's engagement with the next chapter is being discounted by the history of the previous ones. The audience starts applying a coefficient. They have seen Darcy fall in love before. They have seen the other party launch a project before. The coefficient goes down. The engagement numbers reflect the coefficient going down. And the brand deals, which are priced off the engagement numbers, start to reflect the coefficient going down in ways that are visible in the quality and quantity of the partnerships being announced. When two people whose individual platforms are both plateauing have the same conversation, and that conversation is with their respective management teams, running the numbers, the structural logic that emerges from the numbers points in the same direction. Collaboration. Specifically, collaboration with someone whose audience has significant overlap with yours, but also distinct segments you do not currently reach. Specifically, collaboration that generates a news cycle of its own, independent of any content either party produces, just by virtue of existing. Two former enemies collaborating is in the current media ecosystem, a story. It generates coverage that no individual announcement from either party could generate. It creates a multiplier effect on reach that the numbers in the spreadsheet make very compelling. I am not suggesting the alliance is purely financial. I am suggesting that the financial logic created the conditions under which a genuine human conversation became possible, a conversation that might not have happened if both parties were still riding individual growth curves steep enough to make the cooperation feel unnecessary. There is something important to say here about timing, and about the specific window that opens between people who have had a public conflict and then both experienced the particular humbling that public plateaus produce. Pride is expensive. Pride that is subsidized by a growth curve you can point to as evidence that you don't need the other person, that pride is sustainable. Pride in a plateau is a luxury you cannot afford without paying in creative stagnation. Both of them, independently, ran out of affordable pride at approximately the same time. And that synchronized running out of pride is what made the conversation possible. Now here is the part that the fan community is going to struggle with. And I say this with genuine respect for the fan community, because this channel exists within that community and owes its existence to that community's interest in these stories. The fan community invested in the conflict. They chose sides. They built parasocial relationships with the conflict itself, not just with the individuals involved, but with the specific dynamic, the specific grievances, the specific ongoing narrative of incompatibility. There are accounts you follow. I follow them whose entire identity in this space is organized around the opposition between these two people. And now those accounts are holding a contradiction that is not going to be comfortable. The contradiction is this. The thing you built your engagement on was a chapter, not a conclusion. The enmity you documented and amplified and analyzed was real. It was not manufactured for your benefit. It was not performed for your consumption. But it was temporary, and you, in good faith, covered it as if it were permanent, because it looked permanent. Because from the outside, conflicts that have produced that level of documented damage look structural, look irreversible, look like the kind of thing that only escalates rather than resolves. The alliance reveals that assumption as incorrect. And here is the genuinely uncomfortable thing. The more investment you had in the conflict narrative, the more the alliance costs you. Not financially or emotionally. The emotional investment in being right about the permanence of the enmity is now collateral damage in two people's decision to get over themselves and make something together. I want to talk about what this costs Darcy specifically, because the cost is asymmetric, and I think it is not being analyzed with the precision it deserves. Darcy's historical pattern in conflict, which this channel has documented across multiple episodes, was a specific sequence. Escalation, followed by documented injury, followed by withdrawal into a narrative of having been wronged, followed by the deployment of that wronged party narrative as context for subsequent choices. The conflict becomes a chapter in the victimhood arc. The victimhood arc serves multiple functions simultaneously. It generates sympathy from the audience. It provides explanatory framework for behavior that might otherwise look reactive. And it positions Darcy as someone to whom things happen, rather than someone who makes choices that contribute to outcomes. That pattern was not cynical. I want to be careful here. I do not think Darcy deployed it strategically. I think she genuinely experienced the conflicts as injuries, and then narrated the injuries authentically. The pattern was authentic. It was also limiting. Because a narrative in which you are always the one to whom things happen, in which conflict is always something that arrives from outside rather than something generated in part by your own choices, is a narrative that forecloses accountability. And accountability, when you can genuinely access it, is one of the most powerful tools for change available to a human being. The alliance is an act of accountability. Not announcing accountability. She has not released a statement saying, "I acknowledge my contribution to this conflict." The accountability is embedded in the act. You cannot genuinely partner with someone you are still internally casting as the villain in your story. The act of partnership requires a revision of the internal narrative. It requires acknowledging, at least privately, that the conflict was not entirely the other person's fault. Some of what escalated it, some of what made it as public and as damaging as it was, came from choices that Darcy made. That revision, that private accounting of one's own contribution to a disaster, is psychologically expensive. It is far easier to maintain the victimhood narrative and foreclose the partnership than to revise the narrative and take the partnership. She took the partnership, which means she did the revision. That is significant. Let me walk you through the specific moment where this became undeniable, where the alliance graduated from rumor to documented fact. The photograph was not a setup. I want to be clear about this because the initial reaction from the community when the photograph circulated was to read it as a managed PR moment, a staged appearance designed to generate buzz for a project announcement that was already in the pipeline. The photograph was not that. The person who took it was not affiliated with either party's team. It was a candid, taken at an industry event, posted without context, allowed to circulate for 48 hours before either party acknowledged it. That 48-hour window before acknowledgement is important evidence. A managed PR moment does not circulate for 48 hours before acknowledgement. A managed PR moment has the caption and the context and the coordinated posts ready to deploy the moment the image goes live. The 48-hour gap suggests the image got out before the announcement was ready, which means the alliance was real before the announcement, which means the announcement was not creating the alliance. It was catching up to something that had already happened in private. When the acknowledgement came, it was simultaneous, coordinated posts, clearly discussed in advance, clearly calibrated to land the same message from both sides at the same moment. The fact of the coordination is itself evidence. These are two people who have a communications relationship now, who can agree on language and timing, who have, at minimum, a trusted intermediary or a direct line that allows them to synchronize. That infrastructure does not exist between people who are merely being civil at industry events. That infrastructure exists between people who are building something together. And what they announced they were building is specific, not a vague, exciting collaboration coming soon that the internet has learned to discount. A project, named, described in enough detail to be evaluable, with both of their names attached in a way that is clearly contractual, because you do not attach your name to someone else's project at that level of specificity without a contract. Funded, in production, with a timeline. That is the architecture of genuine commitment, and it changes everything about how this has to be analyzed. Here is the financial architecture, because this channel does not shy away from the business reality underlying the human narrative, and understanding the business reality is what makes the human narrative legible. Each of them brings an audience to the collaboration. Those audiences have significant overlap in the shared viewership of anyone who has followed both of their trajectories through the franchise, but they also have distinct segments. Darcy's audience skews toward viewers who are emotionally invested in her romantic journey, who have followed her across multiple seasons, who have a protective relationship with her that is built on years of watching her be vulnerable on camera. The other party's audience has a different texture, more interested in different aspects of the franchise world, different demographics in some segments, and a different emotional investment profile. When you combine those two audiences into the audience for a single project, you do not get arithmetic addition. You get something closer to multiplication, because each party's audience is now being introduced to the other party's content in a context that has been vouched for by someone they trust. The conversion rate of a warm introduction from a trusted source is categorically different from the conversion rate of cold discovery. Both of them just gave their audiences a warm introduction to the other. That is a valuable transaction for both parties, and the value compounds over time as the new cross-audience relationships develop. For brands evaluating partnership opportunities, the combined profile is significantly more attractive than either individual profile. The reach is larger, obviously, but more importantly, the story is more attractive. A collaboration between former enemies who have genuinely reconciled and are now building something together is a narrative that brands can attach themselves to in ways that individual partnerships with either party do not offer. There is a human interest dimension to the collaboration that provides editorial cover for brand integrations. The integration can be framed as part of the collaboration story rather than as an interruption of it. That framing is worth money to brands who are sophisticated about how their integrations land with audiences. The media coverage that the alliance generates organically is also worth money not directly, but in the amplification it provides to every subsequent piece of content either party releases. Every outlet that covers the alliance is creating a new entry point for audiences who were not previously following either of them. That is audience acquisition at zero marginal cost. You cannot buy that. You can only generate it by doing something that genuinely surprises the people who cover the space. Genuine surprise, in a media environment that has become highly sophisticated at detecting and discounting manufactured moments, is one of the rarest and most valuable commodities available. This alliance is genuinely surprising. Not because the people involved are incapable of change, I hope this channel has never argued that, but because the documented history of the conflict created such strong priors against reconciliation that the reconciliation, when it came, landed with the full force of a genuine plot twist. Real life delivered a plot twist, and plot twists in the current content ecosystem generate the kind of sustained engagement that algorithmic platforms are specifically designed to amplify. Now I want to address the people who are watching this and feeling something complicated, not the people who are straightforwardly excited about the alliance, the people who are uncomfortable with it, who feel like something is being taken from them, who find themselves more resistant to the reconciliation than they expected. That resistance is worth examining, because I think it is telling you something real about how you related to the conflict, and specifically about what the conflict was providing you. The conflict between these two public figures was, for a significant portion of the audience, a proxy conflict, a place to park feelings about situations in your own life where you were wronged, where you chose a side, where you invested in a narrative of justified grievance and needed external validation that the grievance was, in fact, justified. Darcy, as a permanent victim of this specific enemy, validated a framework in which some grievances do not have expiration dates, in which some wrongs do not get revised by subsequent evidence, in which the person who hurt you is allowed to remain the villain permanently, because that is what they earned. And now Darcy has stepped out of that framework. And if you are using her story as a mirror for your own, her stepping out of the framework creates a subtle pressure on you to consider stepping out of yours. That pressure is uncomfortable. The resistance to the alliance is partly the resistance to that pressure. Examining it is worth your time, even if examining it is uncomfortable. Especially if examining it is uncomfortable. Here is what the alliance does to Darcy's actual life, not her platform, not her brand, not her engagement metrics. The conflict had been, among other things, a source of isolation. Not dramatically, she was not friendless or professionally abandoned. But the specific isolation of having a documented public enemy in your professional ecosystem is real and ongoing in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Every industry event is a calculation. Every shared social circle is a navigation. Every mutual contact is a potential conduit for information that should not travel. The maintenance of an active enmity in a world as small as the 90-day fiancé adjacent media ecosystem is a tax on cognitive and emotional resources that is ongoing and invisible, but absolutely real. The alliance eliminates that tax, not just in the obvious sense that the event calculations and the shared circle navigations become simpler, in the deeper sense that the mental bandwidth that was being occupied by active enmity maintenance, the background processing that every person with an unresolved conflict runs continuously, whether they are aware of it or not, is now freed. That is not a small thing. That background processing, multiplied across months and years, constitutes a meaningful portion of the cognitive resources available for everything else she is trying to build. There is also something specific about what the former enemy now provides that no other category of person in her circle can provide. Former enemies who have reconciled have a particular kind of knowledge of each other that is unlike any other relationship. They have seen the other person without the performance in the specific circumstances of conflict, which strip away the management and the calibration and the curated presentation and reveal something closer to the unguarded truth of who someone is under pressure. They know the worst of each other. They know it in a documented, witnessed, publicly recorded way, and they have chosen partnership in full possession of that knowledge. That choice made with eyes open, after the evidence of the worst of each other has been fully presented and evaluated, produces a foundation for a relationship that is qualitatively different from anything built on the curated version. The curated version is always, at some level, a risk. What happens when they see the real version? Former enemies have already answered that question for each other. They saw the real version. They are still here. That is a different quality of stability than almost anything else available to either of them in their professional circles. What happens next is where this gets genuinely interesting from an analytical standpoint. The project, once it is released, will be evaluated on two independent tracks simultaneously. Track 1 is the quality of the content itself. Does it deliver? Is it interesting? Does it justify the audience's investment of time? Does it generate enough word of mouth to expand beyond the existing combined audience into new segments? Track 2 is the relationship evidence. Does the on-screen or on-platform chemistry between the two former enemies read as genuine? Does the collaboration feel like two people who have actually resolved something, or two people performing resolution for an audience that has been promised resolution? Does the private work of genuine reconciliation show up as something legible and real in the public output? Track 2 is the more important track. Not for the content's commercial success track, one determines that, but for the long-term significance of what they are building. Because if the relationship evidence on track 2 is authentic, if what comes through is real people who have genuinely done the work of revision and accountability and found their way to a collaboration that is more than the sum of its financial logic, then the project becomes something the content ecosystem does not produce very often. It becomes evidence that change is possible, not performed change. Demonstrated change. This channel has spent 33 episodes in this particular series, analyzing the gap between announced change and demonstrated change. It is, in my view, the most important gap in the analysis of public figures who are navigating personal and professional evolution in real time. Announced change is cheap. It generates engagement. It satisfies the audience's appetite for resolution and narrative arc completion. But it does not last, because the behavior that follows announced change is evaluated against the announcement, and when the behavior falls short as it usually does, because change is harder than announcement, the audience's investment in the announcement becomes evidence of having been manipulated. Demonstrated change does not need announcement. It shows up in the behavior, in the choices, in the things that happen that are inconsistent with the old pattern. The alliance demonstrated change. Nobody announced it in advance. Nobody wrote a caption about growth journeys before it happened. It happened. And then it was acknowledged. And the acknowledgement was of a fact, a project, a collaboration, a business commitment, rather than of an emotional state or an intention. That sequence demonstration before announcement, fact before narrative, is the sequence of genuine change rather than performed change. And I would be failing in this channel's specific mission if I did not call that out clearly and directly. Here is my final read on what this moment represents, not for the entertainment value it generates, and not for the business case it presents, but for what it actually means as a human development. Two people who hurt each other, publicly, documentably, in ways that will remain accessible in the search results for as long as those search results exist, have decided that the fact of the injury does not determine the architecture of the future. They have decided, both of them, that what was done is part of the record, but not the conclusion of the record. They have decided to write additional entries, to build something that will exist alongside the documentation of the enmity, and over time, by virtue of being real and ongoing and productive, will provide a more complete picture of who both of them actually are than the conflict alone was providing. That decision is an act of genuine courage, not the performed courage of the inspirational caption. The quiet courage of choosing a more complicated relationship to your own past than the one that generates the most sympathy. I have watched Darcey Silva across more seasons of more shows than I can enumerate without checking my notes. I have watched her make choices that this channel analyzed with what I hope was rigor and what I know was care, because whatever your read on her behavior in specific situations, she is a person navigating her life in public in ways that deserve to be engaged with seriously, rather than dismissed or simplified. And across all of that watching, this specific development, this specific choice is the one that has surprised me most, and surprised me in a direction I did not anticipate being surprised in. I expected the next chapter to be another variation on a familiar pattern, another romance, another escalation, another documented injury, another withdrawal into the wronged party narrative, another season of content built on the sympathetic protagonist architecture that has served her across multiple platforms. What I got instead was this: a former enemy, a shared project, a business commitment with both names on it, a 48-hour window where a candid photograph circulated before anyone was ready to explain it, a double acknowledgement that was clearly coordinated and clearly described something real. That is not a variation on a familiar pattern. That is a new pattern. And new patterns, after this many years of watching someone navigate their public life, are the rarest and most meaningful things this work produces. We will cover every development of this project as it moves from production to release. We will apply to the alliance the same analytical rigor we applied to the conflict, which means we will not over-celebrate when the going is good, and we will not over-catastrophize when the inevitable complications arise. Because nothing this structurally interesting moves from conflict to collaboration without complications. We will watch carefully, we will report honestly, and we will maintain the same standard this channel has held across 33 episodes of this series, that the most important story is never the one being announced. It is always the one being demonstrated. Subscribe to the Tell-All Tapes. If you have been here for all 33 of these, you know that what we do here is different. We do not cover the caption. We cover the contract. We do not cover the announcement. We cover the behavior that follows. We do not cover the performance of change. We cover the evidence of it. And today, for the first time in this series, what we are covering is evidence of something better than what came before. That is worth your subscription. That is worth the like. That is worth the notification bell, so that when the project drops and we are here to analyze every frame of it against the record we have built together, you do not miss a single second of what comes next. 33 episodes in. The most surprising content we have ever produced, and we are just getting started.